Assalamu alaikum and hello to everyone, to the viewers and the panelists. We would like to welcome you to this session on Bacha Khan's translated autobiography at the Lahore Literature Festival 2021. The original biography in Pashto Zamajwan or Jaddujahed has been translated into English. And the translation of that in English is My Life and Struggle. The original autobiography was written by Bacha Khan and completed in 1983. Today's panel is really on the relevance of his book today and the relevance of his philosophy today. Before we start the discussion, I would like to thank the Lahore Literature Festival organizers. I especially would like to thank Mr. Ahmed Rashid, who is internationally known for his book on the Taliban, who has been supportive in us doing this panel. A big thank you to Bilal Zahoor of Folio Books Pakistan. Folio is publishing the book in Pakistan. And we have committed impressive supporters for this book who have written meaningful blurbs on the back of the book. Ahmed Rashid Saab is one of them. Mr. Afrasiab Khattak and Dr. Mukulika Banerjee, who are both with us on the panel today. And last but not least, our young, impressive Malala Yousafzai. The book is also being published by Roli Books in India, who will also be selling it internationally. The author of this translation, the person who did the translation, is Imtiaz Ahmed Sabzada. Sabzada Saab is not with us today, but he's, I'm sure, eagerly watching. He's a retired senior civil servant of Pakistan, and he has authored 2 previous books on Ghani Khan, who was Bacha Khan's son. One is a translation of Ghani Khan's Pashto poetry, and another is a record of his speeches at the Central Legislative Assembly of India in 1946. Sabzada Saab's work on this book started in 2017, and it has been a long journey and a book in itself. And I would like to say that Dr. Banerjee, who's here, has been really, part of the inspiration behind doing this work, because I remember seeing her lecture, the Bacha Khan annual lecture at SOAS, and in that she spoke of how these messages of non-violence, other things like, village cleanliness, the importance of religious tolerance, education, that these messages could be translated into a simple English book for children. And this is when Sabzada Saab and I got together, and I said to him that we need a lucid translation of the autobiography, and he started work on it in 2017. Coming to our panel of today, it's wonderful that we have such amazing experienced speakers. I would like to thank Dr. Mukulika Banerjee and Khattak Saab. Dr. Banerjee has written a book called The Pathan Unarmed, which was first published in the year 2000. And it is quite amazing what she managed to do, because she came to Pakistan and she lived in Wali Khan's house for weeks on end and actually tracked down old Khudai Khidmatgar, of whom she interviewed 80. And they were all probably in their 80s at the time. Many of them are not alive anymore. And it included one woman also, Grana, whom she interviewed. So this first-hand experience of talking to these people who sort of lived in a lost history is really very, very valuable to the country and especially to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. Dr. Banerjee is associate professor at the Department of Anthropology at the London School of Economics. And she was the inaugural director of the LSE South Asia Center from 2015 to 2020. This is The Pathan Unarmed is one of the books that she has authored. Afrasiab Khattak Saab is a name and personality that we in Pakistan are familiar with. Thank you, Khattak Saab, for joining us. He's a political figure, a human rights activist. He's an ex-senator. Most of all, I think for many of us, what is really meaningful about Khattak Saab for us is that he's a well-informed advocate and rights activist for a progressive Pushtun future in Pakistan. As we're talking about Bacha Khan and his vision of united, progressive, non-violent, pluralistic society, this message is very key to us all, and it's something that Khattak Sahab really believes in. The implications of what this region, this country, and particularly the Pushtun belt have gone through, the implications of the war on terror and its direct impact on us is very key. And Khattak Sahib will talk more to the relevancy of Bacha Khan's philosophy today. So without further ado, I would just like to say that each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes. We would like this to be more of a discussion. It's a pre-recorded session, so unfortunately there's no live Q&A. But as you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook, if you put down your questions, we will certainly try and address them at a later stage. So I would now like to invite Dr. Banerjee to speak about Bacha Khan and her experience of coming here, and what she found out. And a lot of what she found out is a lot of what we as citizens of Pakistan don't even know, because as I said, it has been a lost history. Thank you.
Thank you, Shandana. And I think a warm welcome to everyone to this panel. And on behalf of Khattak Sahab, myself, all of us who wrote endorsements and believe in this book, our collective thanks to Shandana herself for having put her life's energy behind making this happen, of working on the translation with Imtiaz Sahab and working with Folio and Roli to make everything happen. So we owe her our thanks. I mean, every book, needs to be brought into being. But this one that we are celebrating today, just as we are coming up to Bacha Khan's birthday on the 16th of February, it's a unique voice in today's world in the 21st century. And we want to, Khattak Sahab and I will try and bring out why we think it is a unique voice and why everybody should read it, buy it, get their children to read it, gift it to friends, buy it. Shandana asked me about my own journey, with this story. And for that, we need to go back to Bacha Khan's death on the 20th of January in 1988. I was a master's student in Delhi University, in the Delhi School of Economics, and we were reading about Pashtun society through the works of Akbar Ahmed and others. And in the middle of our course, suddenly the newspapers announced Bacha Khan's death. And all the Indian newspapers at the time, in January 1988, had huge headlines. Frontier Gandhi dies, non-violent soldier of Islam, the greatest one who ever lived. There was an outpouring of grief and salutation to this extraordinary person. Now, if you were growing up in India in the 70s and 80s, as I did, you knew this name. You knew this name, Frontier Gandhi. You knew it stood for Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. You didn't quite know more than that, but what you did know, even as a child, was this: of all the freedom fighters, of all the great men and women who fought for independence from British colonialism, Bacha Khan had a special place, in a way that Gandhiji had a special place. And these two people were in a completely different league to everybody else. There were lots of greats, of course, but these two people had something extraordinary and special. And it's in recognition of that I urge you all to look at the digital resources, to go back to that extraordinary moment in the subcontinent's history, in the history of the South Asia region, when Bacha Khan was very ill in All India Institute of Medical Sciences in Delhi, in the hospital, and it looked like the end was near, he was flown back to Peshawar so he could die at home. But then he had said before he died, I do not want to be buried in Pakistan. The Indian government had offered to him a resting place between Gandhi's mausoleum and Nehru's, between Rajghat and Shantivan. And they had said, we would like to honor him and build a mausoleum to him between these two greats of contemporary India, of independent India. And Bacha Khan had said no. He had said, I do not want to be buried in India or Pakistan. Please bury me in my home in Jalalabad in Afghanistan. So this is 1988. Missiles were flying across the Durand Line, and extraordinary thing happened. There was a ceasefire called of the war. There was absolutely no shelling for 24 hours, and thousands of people traveled from Peshawar to Jalalabad across the Durand Line into Afghanistan, and his funeral was held there. Heads of state, Rajiv Gandhi and his family came there. People gave it the sort of significance and honor that you would give a head of state and more, somebody, a great soul, right? That was the recognition. Now, this had me all very intrigued. I was reading this in the newspapers and saying, wow, this doesn't, you knew then, even in my early 20s, as a youngster, I knew this was one of those moments that happens once in your lifetime, where you get to witness this kind of thing. And began to look for accounts of what this extraordinary movement was about. Thousands and thousands of Pashtuns, of Muslim men and women who believed in civil disobedience, of complete nonviolence. What on earth was going on? And there were no accounts. So I said that I could read. There were some biographies of Bacha Khan written by Gandhiji's biographer Tendulkar. And it was very interesting. But I wanted to hear the voice of the Khodai Khidmatkars themselves and what it was like to be, the follower of somebody like Bacha Khan. So there was no account. So I then had to, through lots of different machinations, I couldn't go from India. In India, they considered it too dangerous for a young Hindu woman to be going to Pakistan, and that to Peshawar and Charsadda. So then I went to England and, went via England, went to Oxford, and then did this for my PhD. I would like to talk about my experience of being in the frontier, as it was used to be called, the NWFP, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But if I may, Khattak Saab met Bacha Khan. I didn't. My interest in Bacha Khan started, as I said, with his death and extraordinary funeral. But Khattak Saab, I would love to hear your memories of Bacha Khan. Do you remember the funeral? Did you have family who went? Did you go for it? Please tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you very much for the background that you have provided us. Yes, I had the honor of not only knowing him, but also working with him as his young follower when he returned back from his exile in 1972. What was very impressive was his determination and strong will for his work of reformation and creating political awareness. I think he was working in a society which was tribal for centuries. All the world was tribal, but people, other societies grew out of it soon. But in Pashtuns, it sort of overextended. And I believe Pashtuns and Baloch probably are the last tribal societies in South Asia. So this was a society which had remained out of modernity, ruled by conventions and customs. But Bacha Khan decided to reform this society and politicize it and bring it to the mainstream of South Asia and the world. And he started his work as reformer, and he was always very proud of his work as reformer, and he was always referred to it and referred to himself as somebody who had started his work as social reformer. So he focused on education. He also talked about giving up revenge and going for compromise, peace. And he also raised his voice for oppressed people, for peasants and people who did manual work in rural Pashtun society. But I think a very important thing that he did was transformation of Pashtun Wali, this Pashtun rivaj or custom or tradition, a way of life, Pashtun way of life. He modernized it. He added democracy. For example, he said, no, the leader will be elected. The leaders will be elected. They wouldn't be just leader by birth because they are tribal chieftains or feudal lords. No, they'll be elected. And then he also tried to include women in social and political life. And that's why he encouraged women right, not only women education, but also he encouraged women writers to write in Pashtun or Pakhtun, the organ of Khudai Ki Madgar movement that started in 1929. I think he carried on this work. And when he reached to our generation, we saw him still as determined as he was in the early 20th century. But I think it's very important to have this translation because unfortunately we don't have very good history books in our curriculum. And most of the writings are about controversies of the partition, pre-partition and post-partition political life. But there is not much which is a rational presentation of freedom struggle and reformation struggle that went in the struggle against colonialism. So Bacha Khan's work is very relevant because, as I was saying, he taught us to serve people. He said it was our duty as human beings. He would not accept compliments when people would go on praising him. He would say, no, but I have been doing my duty. And he said, so should you. And everybody should do their duty. And his humility was really disarming. It was so impressive, his humility and his warmth and his dedication. He was a practicing Muslim, but he would never do it to impress others in politics. Once somebody told him in my presence that you have gone to Hajj, but you don't write Haji with your name. He said, yes, I do pray 5 times, but should I write Namazi with my name? He said, yes, I give money to poor according to Islam. I pay zakat, but should I write myself as Abdul Ghaffar Khan Zakati? So he sort of brushed aside these notions. And you see, we could see that by having experience of mainstream South Asian politics, his vision stood above religion, race, language, social status. He was a true humanist. His love for Pashtuns did not limit him, limit his love to only Pashtuns. He loved people everywhere in the world, and we saw in Indian subcontinent, he reached everywhere where he was required to stand by oppressed, to stand by aggrieved and marginalized people. So I think that is a legacy that is very important, and it came very handy to my generation. For example, when my party, I mean, Awami National Party, where I was the provincial president of that party, in 2008, when it came into power in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, for example, when we were addressing the language question, we adopted 5 mother tongues in our province as medium of instruction. And we legislated for these 5 languages. Apart from Pashto, they included Hindko, Saraiki, Kohistani, Chitrali, which is also called Khowar. So this is something that we had inherited from Bacha Khan. He had taught us that we should respect diversity, we should respect languages, and democracy is about respecting diversity and not imposing things on others. So I think it is very important for us today to go back to his life and struggle. And this book is very important today for us and our coming generations.
Thank you, Khattak Sahib. We'll come back to so many important points you've raised, but Mukulika, just back to you. I mean, we'd be very interested in knowing what was your experience when you met these Khudai Khidmatgar, and what was their feeling, at the time that you met them. As I said earlier, it has been sort of a lost history, and its resurgence today is actually quite powerful. And maybe Khattak Sahib can talk more about that later. But what was your experience of meeting them? What were they saying to you?
So you're so right. I think it is a lost history, and it's a silenced history. It was a history it hasn't been lost because of the accidents of time. It was a suppressed history. So after independence came in 1947 and Pakistan was formed, the Khudai Khidmatgars and their leader Bacha Khan, Dr. Khan Sahib, they were seen to be traitors of the new nation, mainly because they were very strong allies with the Congress. And they had formed three ministries. After all, they had formed three governments. They had fought elections, and the Khudai Khidmatgar backed Congress government in the Northwest Frontier Province, had been very successful. So they were very clear political allies of the Congress, but independence and partition came together, and they were left, in a sense, to deal with the new dynamics of new nation of Pakistan, and were seen. So when I found these old Khudai Khidmatgars, and I started to talk to them about their movement, very haltingly first, they could not believe that somebody was asking them about something that had happened 50 years ago, because I was there in the early 1990s, because they hadn't had a chance to talk about it. So, typically what would happen is I had a wonderful older brother and friend, Habibullah, who lived near Charsada. And Habibullah was very kind. He took me in his car looking for old Khudai Khidmatgars. His father used to be a Khudai Khidmatgar, Israr Khan, and he passed away just before I arrived. So Habibullah Lala and I used to go from village to village looking for old men, literally saying, who's the oldest? Who's the oldest? Were you a Khudai Khidmatgar? And then if somebody responded, we'd start talking. But and we did this, across, we went down to Kohat, where Khattak Sahib is from, Dera Ismail Khan, Banu, and right up to Sawat in the north. So everywhere, the Khudai, there was disbelief that they were allowed now to talk about this history, because these narratives about the freedom struggle had been completely suppressed. They hadn't been able to tell their stories. So they would keep saying to me, they said, but you're Indian, aren't you? I said, yes, I am Indian. They said, and you're not even Muslim. I said, no, I'm not Muslim. Then what has brought you here? And I'd say, well, I've come to hear your stories. And they said, no, we'll tell you our stories. You're here. Of course, we'll tell you our stories. But what has really brought you here? And I said, no, my only job here is I've only come here to listen to your stories. And there would be tears and blessings and hugs. And they'd say, after all these years, somebody is interested, because for 50 years we've been thinking, we fought so hard, we went to jail so many times, we suffered such indignities at the hands of the colonial government, and we were punished for it after independence, having fought for that independence. We were silenced, our movement was banned, we had to burn our wonderful red uniforms, the surposh, the red shirts that the colonial government used to call them. Everybody wore a red uniform. We had to burn our papers, our markers was bombed. So all the traces of our struggle for independence, our immense fight for independence, have been erased. So now, after all these years, to start talking about these stories again is unbelievable. And then then the halting memories began to come back. And then, you ask what it was like. So then I'd say, okay, then, I'd spend several hours talking to, say, one person. And then he'd say, well, I'd say at the end, are you in touch with anyone else? They said, no, we're all old men now, and we're not really in touch. And Habibullah Lala would say, well, can you think of any names? And they said, oh, well, there used to be this person in so-and-so village. I don't know whether he's still alive. Said, do you remember? Let's go and check him out. So then this original Khuda Khidmatgar, this elderly gentleman would come in our car, and then we would go to that village looking. And in some cases, the person would be alive. And can you imagine meeting friends that you had gone to jail with? 50 years you haven't seen them. And then these two men would reunite. And the first hour or two would be we just had to leave them alone because they had so much to talk about amongst themselves. Then we would slowly start to talk to them about the movement. And it was almost as if they were reliving that extraordinary solidarity, as Khattak Sahib was saying, that, Pashtun society, like a lot of traditional societies, is defined by clans, by lineages, by marriage rules, by territory. You're divided as a community in all these different ways. But one of the extraordinary things the movement did, the Khuda Khidmatgar movement did, really because of Bacha Khan's persuasion, was to say, look, leave all that behind. Leave your enmities behind. Leave your divisions behind. Wear this uniform. Take this oath. Every Khuda Khidmatgar used to swear an oath. And once you've taken this oath and worn this uniform, you're part of the movement. You're a Khuda Khidmatkar. You're a soldier of this nonviolent movement. That is your identity. And that is certainly what they used to tell us, that this is, so we are soldiers of this movement before anything else. So that solidarity was a completely new kind of identity that was created in the struggle for independence. And this is a phenomenon wider that happened across the Indian subcontinent, as indeed across the world. When you fight for a cause, your identification with that cause becomes your main purpose. So that's how you know yourself. So like this, we found over 75 elderly Khuda Khidmatkars who all had their own stories. And what was extraordinary was for the first few weeks that I was staying in Walibag in Wali Khan's house, who had just adopted me as his daughter, and his daughters made me their sister. It was really the most wonderful experience of being welcomed in Pakistan. But in all of this, the Khuda Khidmatkars themselves were invisible in a story if you stay at just this level of the leaders. People would say, oh, all the main leaders have passed away. Bacha Khan has died, but also some of the senior leaders have passed away. But it was these ordinary voices that relived Bacha Khan's memory, and they talked about him as if he was amongst them. That is the power of the memory of the man, that it was as if they had anecdotes, like Khattak Sahib was saying, they would say, every village I went to in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, people would say, you see that hut there? You see that room on the side? Bacha Khan, when he came to our village, he used to stay there. He used to lie on a charpai here. And before anything else, the moment he entered, the first time he came to our village, the first thing he did was he found a broom from somewhere lying there and he started cleaning the village. And people would say, who's this person? He's just come into our village and he's cleaning it. And others would say, but at least he's doing something good. Then somebody said, he's a really big Khan. Why is he cleaning? But that would get them curious enough to engage with him. And then he'd say, look, I want to talk about independence. I want to talk about self-rule. I want Pashtuns to own their own destiny. But if we can't even keep our villages clean, how can we ask for independence? Let's at least start by doing what is in our hands. So what Khattak Sahib was saying about the reformist movement, social reform really began at home, didn't it? I mean, it began at the level of the individual and the village.
Thank you. So, absolutely. First, we see for political reasons that despite the fact that, at independence and in the newly created Pakistan Assembly, Bacha Khan pledged his allegiance to the new country. And for political reasons, he was sidelined, mainly by Qayyum Khan in the NWFP. And this sort of rift was created between him and Jinnah Sahib. And after that, it has sort of been never been lived down, this thing of traitor and Hindu sympathizer and things like that. But I think the key lessons were not those lessons. The key lessons are the things you've talked about. And really, with this entire, endless phase of war on terror, I mean, this is what really, we need to, as a region, as a country, and especially as Pukhtuns or Pashtuns, that these are the lessons that we need to learn. And I think today the relevance of those is even much more. And I'd like Khattak Sahab to talk a bit about that today. I mean, do you think this thing is coming back as a positive, this non-violence, this tolerance? Because there is a lot, there is a lot which is against this, and it has, destroyed us in so many ways. Where do you think is the hope for something like this today?
Well, as Professor Banerjee was saying, we have weakness because we are not informed about our national liberation struggle. This has turned into our weakness because it's difficult to understand the games of new colonialism because we are cut off from our struggle against the colonial rule, which had gone on for many centuries. But in any case, I mean, this biography or this translation of it will help us in overcoming that lack of information, the gap that we have in our memories, particularly our younger generations. I think Bacha Khan, up till the end of his life, he very strongly stood for nonviolence, peace, and harmony among human beings. I remember he opposed the war in Afghanistan. He was very strongly opposed to violence that erupted in Afghanistan in late 1970s and early 1980s. And he tried his level best to put that fire down. He wanted to go to the Soviet Union. Actually, he was contacting Ms. Indira Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister, to get in touch with Brezhnev, the then Soviet leader, because he wanted to meet him, to convince him that he should take his forces out of Afghanistan, because he didn't want to see this war going on. And he would always tell people who would come to him, those Afghans who were fighting from both sides, when they would come to him, he would always tell them, it is not really a genuine fight that you're fighting. It's the big powers struggle and the competition that is being fought at the cost of your blood and the destruction of your country. So he kept on his struggle for peace up till the very end. And today it is very important because he stood for tolerance. You see, this non-violence involves tolerance. Unfortunately, from 1980s, our region has seen the rise of extremism, religious extremism in particular. Particularly when war in Afghanistan was being fought, billions of dollars were invested in promoting extremism. It became part of our education system. Even today, we have this problem in our education system. And particularly the religious education was really invested with extremist ideas from other countries, particularly from the Middle East, unfortunately. Bacha Khan's ideas are very relevant because even in 1920s, when he was spreading education in Pashtun lands, this education did not include hatred. Even after spending around 33 years in prison, he wouldn't hate anyone. He would always try to approach people and talk to them with logic, reason, negotiate, listen to others patiently, and also try to convince them. So I think it's very important for us to learn from his life experience because it is everybody's right to have a belief in religious or other ideologies that he or she may follow. But the thing gets wrong when we say, oh, my ideology is right and the other ideology is wrong or evil. Then we even don't stop there. We say, oh, that ideology should be eliminated. And this is how things go bad and what we are seeing even today in our society. So I think it's very important to include the life and struggle of people like Bacha Khan, who stood for freedom, human rights, peace, non-violence. I think this legacy is more relevant today, particularly for Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, where extremist forces are threatening our freedom that our people got at great cost after great struggle against foreign colonialists. It is under threat because of this extremist threat. Our state systems are facing an existential threat. So I think it's very important to discover icons like Bacha Khan, and I'm sure this translation will help us in achieving this goal.
So, of course, Khattak Sahab, as you said, and as Bacha Khan himself had said, that if there is an involvement, from Pakistan in the war in Afghanistan, the fire will come to your own home. And really, this is what we have suffered across the region, but particularly, in Pakistan, and particularly on the borders with Afghanistan. And this is a very key lesson for our young people. Young people who, a lot of them don't know this history, and I'm glad that it's there in English, so a lot of the younger educated people will now read it. And there has been a loss of history, a loss of culture, and this doesn't go towards strengthening a society. It goes towards weakening a society. And these things which are positive, they must be, they should be included in our curriculum. There should be more discussions on this. There should be discussions really with younger people and even with children on these things, as Dr. Banerjee was saying. So that is very, very important. It is a challenge because, forces that counter all these things, these principles, these values, they seem to be very, very strong. And this seems to be the case across the world. I think we have very little time left. Could I request Dr. Banerjee to make her concluding remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Shandana. I just wanted to say that, for readers who will buy this book, I hope, and read it, it's very easy to turn somebody like Bacha Khan into a saint, right? And to make him be this, he was larger than life, but to somehow say, oh, he could do it because he was an extraordinary person. What has that got to teach with me? We can turn this into a hagiography. That's what a lot of biographies of him do. Now, what is different in reading the autobiography, you'll see when you read this, is three things. One is you find it is tireless work all his life without rest. He'd fall ill and jail conditions were so bad. Invariably, he got really badly ill in jail. Then he would have to come out and recover. But before he had fully recovered, he was back doing the work. Standing for something that you believe is right. It's not even ideological. It is about truth. It's about saying, look, we want to do this in a just way. We want to fight for our rights without killing other people, without saying other people are extremist or wrong or bad or whatever. We want to keep our focus on what we think is the just war, the just struggle. But that takes work. And I think this is the lesson for all of us, certainly for generations, that any kind of political activism or just social activism requires commitment. You can't take your eye off the ball, and you get that sense of tireless work from his autobiography. If you read it, I went here, I went there, I traveled there, came out of jail, I spent so many months in jail, fell ill. It's an endless cycle. That's one thing. The second point to remember is that we talk about an enormous figure like Bacha Khan, and quite rightly, as both my co-panelists have been saying, we must remember this history, especially in Pakistan. I have so many friends, students, colleagues in Pakistan. I'm aware of conversations that go on there. There is a strange stereotype of Pashtuns that the rest of Pakistan outside Pakhtunkhwa work with, which really is the result of ignorance. If you don't engage with a place, you stereotype it. You don't know anything about it. You don't have friends from there. You stereotype it. But it is also, I think, what is important to remember is that when Bacha Khan is remembered for having been one of the top freedom fighters, remember when they started their struggle, they didn't know that independence would come in 1947. I always say this to my students, Looking back, we say, oh, the movement was set up in 1930, and then in 1947, independence came. But when they started in the 1920s with earlier organizations that were formed before Khuda Ki Khidmat movement got us, they didn't know what the end was. They just kept working, and one day the end came. So we don't know where our struggles are going to get us. But what they knew, and my big takeaway from a book like this is that if you read it, there is complete conviction that every day I will wake up and I will fight for justice, and then one day it will come. And I think that's very important. And finally, the third point is that this is not just a Pashtun story as well. It is a Pashtun story, and yet if you look around the globe, any movement that is celebrated and remembered with respect has been one of civil disobedience. There's no question about that. It is people, when they're courageous without arms, that is real courage. To be courageous with fighting with weaponry is not courage. It is fighting with weaponry. But if you want to really understand what courage is, Pashtuns know this, right? Because there is an engagement with violence. They know what it's to fight, to be with an arm, with a rifle, without a rifle. It takes real courage to fight unarmed because you have truth and justice on your side. And that, I think, for the ordinary reader, for the ordinary citizen, anyone picking up this book, that is the message I'd like you to take away from it. Thank you.
Thank you. That is wonderful. Khattak Sahib, a request for your concluding remarks and the relevance of what we've been talking about for us today, and especially for our youth today.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think the agenda of Bacha Khan and other freedom fighters in the 20th century, first half of the 20th century, remains unfinished and remains unimplemented as far as their struggle for empowerment of people who are oppressed, exploited, and their struggle for including those who are excluded is still unimplemented. And South Asian states, unfortunately, haven't delivered for what these states had come into being. So our younger generations are duty bound to carry on this struggle so that the vision of freedom fighters or forefathers is implemented, and also new realities should be faced, and new challenges should be also faced, and the younger generation should be well equipped to do that. I'm glad to see that our younger generation are gradually rising, gradually awakening. And one very good example is the current uprising among Pashtun youth these days. I think a very important sign of Bacha Khan's influence on the younger generation is the commitment of these young people to nonviolence. They are putting their demands without violence, and they refuse to be provoked even in the face of violence. They don't resort to counter-violence. They just go on with their non-violent struggle. Secondly, the demands are according to law, according to constitution. They are not sort of rebels who would just try to disrupt things, but they want to build a new society based on law, constitution, and civilized norms. So I think that is something encouraging. But at the same time, we have great challenges on the state level in South Asia, particularly because Pakistan and India are nuclear armed states. And in his last phase of his life, Bacha Khan had realized this danger of a nuclear threat which can face South Asia, and he referred to it on one or two occasions. He mentioned it, that we should be very cautious against the weapons of mass destruction, because these weapons are anti-life, anti-humanity, and these should be illegal. I mean, the state should not resort to have these weapons. Now these weapons are there, so now we have to work for peace in the region. And it's very important to go back to Bacha Khan's idea, particularly because he is the one who struggled in United India in South Asia. He's buried in Afghanistan. So when he died in January 1988, we saw that in spite of the fact that he had not been in power even for 1 hour, personally, he was never in power, but the flags of the three countries were lowered to honor him, to honor his life and struggle. India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, all the three countries showed the respect to him. So I think he can become a bridge between these three countries in forming friendship and resolve their problems through peaceful negotiations. They have differences and they should resolve their differences peacefully. And Bacha Khan's life and struggle can become a factor for all these three countries. So I think this book will help the public opinion makers in all these three countries to say things which are in interest of peace and in interest of prosperity of all humanity, and particularly the downtrodden people.
Thank you so much, and what a wonderful note that we conclude on is what you said about the three countries, and we just wish that at all levels that this message could bring peace and could bring talking and could bring tolerance across our three countries where he is so revered.